Me place presentar hoy a la doctora Joanne Entwistle, que es profesora de Estudios Culturales y Creativos en el King's College de Londres. Anteriormente fue profesora de Sociología en la Universidad de Essex. Obtuvo su doctorado en Sociología del Goldsmiths College en 1997. Sus campos de investigación son muy diversos: la moda, el vestido, el género y la sexualidad, las y los modelos, el trabajo cultural, la iluminación de las casas, que hace con su marido, entre otros temas. Pero por lo que hoy nos concierne, Entwistle es autora de The Fashion Body, Fashion Dress and Modern Social Theory, que fue publicado en el año 2000 y en el que trata temas tan importantes como la moda, el vestido y el cambio social, moda e identidad, moda y género, moda, adorno y sexualidad. También es coeditora con la profesora Elizabeth Wilson de Body Dressing en 2001. Estos han sido estudios de referencia para entender de una manera diferente el vestido. Si hasta este momento se estudiaba la historia del vestido y de la moda, a partir de su trabajo de referencia de Fashion Body, en el año 2000 empezamos a ver la relación entre la moda, el vestido y el cuerpo. Y en mi caso, con Teresa Bastardas, que está aquí, es una de las bases teóricas para la construcción de nuestra exposición El cuerpo vestido en el Museo del Diseño de Barcelona, que pueden ustedes aún ver. El cuerpo hay que destacar también otras obras que son The Aesthetic Economy of Fashion, Markets and Value in Clothing and Modeling, Fashioning Models, Images, Industry and Text, con Elizabeth Wissinger en 2012, que es un estudio sobre el modelaje de moda masculina que explora cuestiones de identidad y de carrera. Hoy nos va a hablar de los debates de cómo ha variado, se ha desarrollado los estudios en torno a The Fashion Body, sobre todo en temas de descolonización, de cambio climático. Es decir, este año ya ha salido la tercera edición de este libro en inglés y está puesta al día. Ella considera que la del año 2000 está un poquito como pasada de moda y habla de género, cambio climático, descolonización, que son temas que nos preocupan hoy actualmente en gran manera. Y también nos hablará hoy de The Golden Girls, que son las chicas de oro, que era un programa de televisión en los años 80 y 90 y que examina un nuevo campo de estudio que, a mi entender, es sumamente interesante, que es la edad, la imagen, la moda, el vestido de las mujeres cuando envejecemos. Muchas gracias. The floor is yours.
Wow, thank you very much. That's probably the longest introduction I've ever had. Thank you. It's my whole biography. Well, it is my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to try and time myself so I don't speak for longer than an hour. And I've been told to speak quite slowly because there's no translation. So I hope I'm slow enough. I hope you understand. I'm from Liverpool originally. I live in London, but I speak very fast. We all speak very fast in Liverpool, so I will try to speak slowly. So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me here. It's really, really is a pleasure to talk about my work. Pandemic-wise, I haven't actually given one of these lectures in a long time, a public lecture in a new place, so this is brilliant. This conference comes at an interesting time in the field of fashion studies and follows the publication of the third edition of my book, The Fashion Body, which was published, I think, in June 2003, so this year. 23 years after its first publication and 8 years after the second edition. So let me just give you an outline of the book, because as I mentioned, this is a very exciting time for fashion studies. And I want to first talk about the current developments that I have discussed in the book. 4 significant developments I'll outline that have made it into the third edition. and it was a 12,000-word extension of the first book. So it was really lots of new material and a bigger bibliography, lots of current material made it into the new book. And then in part 2, and I think as you have heard, I will talk about a paper that hasn't been published. It should be published in 2004, perhaps 2005, the Golden Girls and older women, fashion and aging. So that's my paper today. When I was invited, let me start with my current developments and the book, The Fashion Body, in the 3rd edition. When I was invited by Polity, my publisher, to update the book, it was a marvelous opportunity, because although the book had been in print since 2000, in 23 years, fashion studies has just become a massive field. When I wrote the book in the late 90s, following my PhD in 1997, there was no field of fashion studies. It didn't exist. There were a few texts. There was Elizabeth Wilson's Adorned in Dreams, which was a major influence on my work on the PhD. And Christopher Brouard had done a very excellent cultural history of fashion. And then there were some fashion historical books. But it wasn't a field. And so in the subsequent fact that it was in print for 23 years, but all this other work had been published, and the book was speaking to an audience from 2000 where this field didn't exist. And the 2015 edition was a small facelift. It was a little bit here and a little bit there. It was a new preface and some new material at the end of one chapter. So 2015, the book wasn't substantially updated. Didn't have the energy. I couldn't do it then. I just didn't feel able to do it. So when they asked me to do a new version, a 3rd edition with lots of new material, I was very, very, very pleased to do that, because a lot has happened in the field of fashion studies. It's a very dynamic area of research, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary area of research. Am I visible? Am I audible? Oh, sorry. Is that better? Aha. Sorry. Okay, so some of the developments that made it into the new edition that I felt were really important, I've marked 4 in particular. They're the 4 key ones. I have other things I've discussed in the book that I won't mention here. The first theme, I'm hoping that's legible. I had a lot of text, it's quite small, I apologize. I hope you can read it. The first area that needed entry in the new edition, the 3rd edition, was a re-examination of the Eurocentric, ethnocentric, Western focus on fashion, in fashion history, and in my book in particular, and this concern to decolonize the curriculum and open up to debates about fashion beyond the global north. And this impacts both the definition of fashion, how do we define it, what are its key characteristics, and the history, the narrative that we give of fashion. In the original book in 2000, and in 2015, because I didn't change it, I set out the accepted history and definition of fashion and dress, and reviewed the literature on the historical emergence of the fashion system in the European context, emerging out of court societies in the 14th century, European court societies. And that early edition of the book and the 2015 book took that narrative from Elizabeth Wilson and Christopher Brouard's work, as I've mentioned. And there's an established history here which define fashion as a system of dress that is characterized by constant aesthetic change. It is undoubtedly an understanding of fashion tied to the narrative of European development and progress, with fashion having been said to develop and emerge from court societies from around the 14th century. So this definition and history of European fashion is, in these typical traditional accounts, contrasted with dress. In so-called traditional societies, which were thought, by contrast, to remain static over time or change very slowly. European societies are therefore said to have a fashion impulse. We want new things, new aesthetics all the time. And that's not found in traditional societies that emphasize stability over change. That's the standard narrative. In the new edition, I now acknowledge a growing body of scholarship that has challenged the conventional definition of fashion history, this conventional narrative and this definition, and the kind of European and ethnocentric nature of that narrative. With new material emerging from historians, archaeologists and anthropologists providing evidence of an earlier, non-Western societies expressing a fashion sensibility, it is necessary to revisit the conventional fashion narrative and definition. That definition is increasingly contested by scholars with these inbuilt assumptions about the history. And I've got some of the names of the people that I reference in the book: Nielsen, Jennifer Craig, Welters, and Lillithan. So now we have the idea that fashion isn't only found in modernizing societies, characterized by rapid social change, relative social mobility, and status competition, in contrast to those traditional societies that were not meant to have those features. The established account, what Nielsen, Welters, and others have called the West versus the rest, is criticized by them as Eurocentric, ethnocentric, in overemphasizing those characteristics of European societies and denying the impetus and the desire for aesthetic change and social change that we can find in earlier cultures. Now the focus in the 2013 book is still European fashion systems, and I look at that the account is fashion from a European context. That is my scholarship. I'm a sociologist and I live in the West. So the narrative, that the story I tell of Western fashion is still there, but I'm acknowledging the possibility that there is emerging research looking at other fashion systems in other parts of the world at other times. So readers are now invited to consider this new material, accepting the notion that aesthetic change could be found in many societies across time and place. But while it is important to consider the ways in which aesthetic change is a characteristic perhaps of all human culture, and not just Western society, I am concerned that we don't universalize the Western, European and Western experience. And I think the point is to understand those other fashion systems, not to say that the European fashion model is happening in all these other places. It's important we retain some notion of historical and geographical specificity when analyzing fashion and dress from other times and across cultures in the contemporary moment. There is also an emerging scholarship on fashion from across the world, in Africa, Latin America, in Asia. I now receive many PhD proposals from students from China wanting to examine aspects of fashion that they see emerging in Chinese society, in fashion on TikTok and so on. It's very new areas of work. With my association with and co-founding the, I have to remember it, the Critical Fashion Studies Seminar Series, the CFSSS, I think it is called, and we shorten it. I set this up alongside Professor Angela McRobbie and Professor Agnes Rocamora. And we've been doing events, most of them online, because we did our first one in person and then COVID happened. And what we see now, we haven't held one in a while, they're very irregular, but when we have one of these, we'll have 100 fashion scholars online. And we are seeing an uptick in scholars from India, Africa, and Latin America giving papers on fashion in their societies. And that's just been fantastic to see. And I actually believe that the future of fashion scholarship really lies in the hands of those young scholars that are looking at fashion beyond the global north. A second area, huge area that's expanded over the last many years is this rise in concerns about sustainability and debates about the contribution of fashion, especially fast fashion, to climate change and the Anthropocene. This area of debate within academia is closely tied to raising public awareness of climate change and the role of fashion, the role that fashion plays within that. As we know, there's loud criticism, often in the newspapers, so not just in academic scholarship, but in the media generally, about fast fashion's excessive use of natural resources, growing awareness of the polluting nature of fashion production, transportation and consumption, and the accumulation of waste post-consumption. Broadly speaking, this literature tends to fall under the banner of sustainability, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals are sometimes cited, and firms have their sustainability statements. And in a 2021 paper, I've examined some of these debates and definitions of sustainability. And I'm especially indebted to the work of Kate Fletcher, who was a former colleague of mine at LCF, London College of Fashion, and John Ehrenfeld's work in this area. According to Ehrenfeld, sustainability is, quote, an empty word. And at its emptiest, it refers to, quote, the capacity of a system to produce something desired over an extended period, end quote. But unless, he argues, we define what that something is, what do we need to sustain, he says that it is, quote, it has, quote, no practical significance, the word sustainability. Indeed, his criticism of this word within the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, he's challenging some of those goals and the kind of general model for capitalist firms to use the idea of sustainability and drop that terminology into their thinking. And he says it leads to small tweaks or techno fixes that don't address wider problems. And the obvious example you can give really is the kind of idea of organic cotton. And Henny's, H&M sell organic cotton products and they're marked as more eco. But it's just a one-issue solution to one problem. It doesn't address wider problems of carbon emissions from transportation, overuse of water as a natural resource in countries that actually have low water level, problems with water. So it's always a very single issue problem, sustainability, when it's taken into companies, fast fashion companies. In my paper, I draw very heavily on the work of Sue Thomas and her work on fashion ethics. And she's keen to replace the term sustainability with the term ethics. Ethics, she argues, is the bigger of the two terms, and she designates it as bigger and more global. It signals a commitment to care for everything, care for the environment, the planet, the non-humans, the animals and plants, as well as the humans within the fashion system. Often sustainability tends to just be directed at the environmental questions and not the kind of human actors and all the problems we know about labor relations, poor labor practices in the fast fashion model, the kind of subcontracting chain all the way to a factory in Bangladesh. And we know all the problems that come with that. So she claims that ethics, and I use her idea in my paper, that ethics is a more meaningful, more inclusive umbrella term through which to consider the many problems of fashion. And I'm also especially inspired by the work of Alice Payne and her excellent comprehensive analysis of fashion design, which embeds sustainability in every aspect of the design process, arguing for a holistic approach, a fashion systems thinking, as she calls it, all the way from design education. She is a fashion design educator in Australia, through to product design and all the aspects of how the product journeys through consumption and post-consumption. And she says, by looking at the whole chain, the whole experience, would enable us to design a better future for fashion. There's a lot of work also being done on alternatives to fast fashion. I'm thinking of the work of Otto von Busch in Parsons in New York and his hacktivism. So he's done lots of different kind of activist projects, working with people to think differently about the fashion system. I also have an excellent PhD student, she's about to complete, working on fashion rental companies as an alternative to consumption of fashion. Okay. My third area that I designate a fair amount of space in the new book is the rise of digital fashion. And here we have an enormous number of developments, and a huge amount has been published in this area from the early work of my friend and co-author and colleague, Agnes Rocamora. She began looking at this years and years ago at the early emergence of bloggers, fashion blogging. And now, of course, we have people doing work on Instagram and other social platforms, beginning of some work on TikTok. Lots of different themes kind of collect under this idea of the digital. To note, I talk a little bit in the book about the Rockamura's idea of disintermediation. With the internet and with Instagram, we have the ability to communicate directly with retailers and brands. We can swipe up and purchase directly, appearing to kind of not go through the mediating work of the fashion buyers in department stores or journalists. We can just directly purchase. So brands speak to us more directly, and we also speak to and can speak to brands as well. So there's an awful lot of work that's been done around prosumption and prosumers, how we participate. We're engaged in the work of production, producing trends, and we're observed doing our trends when we post outfits, and brands are following us and what we do with our clothing. We're part of that production thinking. But there's also work around the influence, the work of influencers and the way in which they do mediate. There are some mediators on platforms like influencers who also work with brands and help promote brands to us as consumers if we're following their stories on Instagram. So there's a whole lot of themes and issues that I take up in that area. And then a fourth and final area of study that I examine within the new edition of the book is around kind of concepts of identity, and but I focus a lot on gender and gendered identities as they are articulated through fashion. And there's a confluence of debate. Many debates are happening in this space, happening within the industry itself and as well as within scholarship. So, and these debates and this challenge to the two-sex model of sex and gender is what I discuss in the book. As we know, fashion has typically been, to quote Elizabeth Wilson, obsessed with gender, with two clearly defined gendered bodies shaped through clothing throughout history. And I was taken on a wonderful tour of the exhibition in the museum in Barcelona, looking at the story of fashion and the changing silhouette. And there is clearly a two-sex model we can see in that history of fashion. However, this binary system is under challenge from a number of quarters. Firstly, emerging out of queer studies, and specifically through the influence of the work of Judith Butler, we've come to see debates about trans identities, challenging that two-sex and two-gender model. In these accounts, sex is unstable and gender is the basis upon which identities can be built, with non-binary and gender-fluid notions challenging or replacing fixed ideas of male-female bodies. However, not all work on trans bodies necessarily destabilizes the binary sex model. For example, I give a summary in the book of Lovelock's paper analysis of Caitlyn Jenner's transformation from Bruce Jenner, as revealed in a Vanity Fair spread. I couldn't find the date when I was doing the research for this, but I think you'll be probably very familiar. Caitlyn Jenner was featured in Vanity Fair at the moment that she came out as female. Lovelock argues that the dominant discourse of the wrong body shapes the reading of Jenner's new body and identity as revealing a natural truth, which, in fact, doesn't challenge biological sex at all because Jenner's body was simply wrongly sexed, while her newly aligned body conforms to conventional gendered norms of feminine embodiment. In this way, what Lovelock is arguing, trans does not automatically challenge the binary, the sex-gender binary. It only has the potential to unsettle gender norms and ideas. According to Bryce, I also summarize her work in this section of the book, trans is, quote, a battleground, and trans bodies are conceptualized as either inherently subversive or regressive. Clearly, celebrity trans women such as Caitlyn Jenner need to be distinguished from transgender activism, much of it challenging the dominant two-sex model. And here we find many developments, a lot of it happening within the fashion industry. So I've shown you the slide from a trans designer. She is Santana Quiros, and she's the creative director behind the brand Narcissism, based in London, which promotes gender fluidity in clothing, and she gave permission for me to use this image. It reproduces in the book as black and white, so it doesn't look very pretty. It's much more dramatic in color. But her brand, Narcissism, is actively challenging and advocating for a more radical thinking of binary notions of sex and gender. However, what is interesting for the future of this whole debate is whether or not we will see the dismantling of menswear and womenswear collections in the industry. We've got a lot of things happening around the edges of the industry, but actually not much is changing in terms of those established, idea of an established collection for men and for women. To what extent will we see gender-neutral clothing emerging over the next next decade or so? Now, this whole body of work in the book kind of fits within a kind of broader debates about diversity and inclusion. And this has become a huge issue within the industry itself, not just within academic scholarship, but inside the industry. There is concern that fashion has, for too long, had a lack of diversity and celebrated a very strict and quite static body and beauty norms. The slim, young, white body of the fashion model has been the standard body of fashion from the earliest couturier salons to modern-day runway collections. And I did some of my research on fashion model agencies a number of years ago now, but that was obviously a very clear feature. All the models are extremely young, extremely tall, and extremely skinny. So yeah, and I reflected on that in other publications. So there's a rich literature now looking at these questions of diversity and how fashion can be more diverse, more inclusive. And I've sort of added my voice to some of this in a 2021 paper with Elizabeth Wissinger for Fashion Theory, where we examine the phenomenon of the Instagram style mum. We were following mums who post their style, and they are much larger than fashion models, much older than fashion models. There's a range of genders and ethnicity, race and ethnicity. So we're black mums, Asian mums. And so we wanted to examine whether these new style mums, who don't look like fashion models, but work with brands now, are often the face of brands or do certain promotions with brands, is this radically changing now, the kind of standard ideal, the beauty ideal in fashion? And we raised some questions about whether that's really happening. We can see some diversity, the way brands will work with women who are much older and much larger than models, but there's a monetarization taking place on the platform. And so increasingly, the women they would work with, the mums, are more likely to be white, more likely to be slim. So there are questions to be asked about monetizing the work that these influencers do and the way that might close down diversity. Okay, so this kind of brings me to the second part of my paper, because I'm really still exploring these questions of diversity and inclusion, yeah? In this paper that I was invited to write. I didn't come up with this. So I was invited to I can't even remember the name of the editor, because it's a very long Slovak name, but I was invited to participate. It's a huge collection of essays on the Golden Girls, and they didn't have anything on fashion and style, so they asked me, would I do something? It's not what I normally do. I don't normally do textual analysis. I'm a sociologist. I usually do interviews and observations of people. I don't normally do textual analysis, but I was really hooked as soon as they asked me to do it. I thought this would be a really fun, and it was fantastic. It's in the editing process. I don't know when it will be published, but I want it to be aired here today. I'll say a few words about my arguments in this paper. So when asked to do it, I thought, yeah, I'm actually quite curious to examine representations of women in aging through fashion, dress, and style. And the Golden Girls seems a very good starting point. Since the 1980s, the Golden Girls has attracted some academic attention. It was a landmark TV show at the time. I mean, the press went crazy for it because it was seen to be quite different. These were older women headlining a show, the narrative driven by their interests, their stories, and it was seen to be a really different way of representing older women, really refreshing. So a lot of academics have focused attention on it. There's an excellent book by Kate Brown, just called The Golden Girls from 2020. And I found some earlier essays. This one by Harwood and Howard was written around the time that the show was being broadcast, probably just as it is first broadcast. And it's quite interesting because in their 1992 paper, written at the time the show was first broadcast, around the time the show was first broadcast, they actually said there's a consensus appearing to exist that the Golden Girls is a valuable and positive representation of the elderly in society. The elderly, I will show you a film in a moment. The actors ranged from 51 to the oldest was 67 at the start of the series. So this really shocked me as well. This was, these women were seen as quote unquote old by people talking about the show at the time. So what I'd like to do in the rest of the time I have today is look at the way in which this show represented older women. It is true that Blanche, Dorothy, Rose, and Sophia, the older lady in the show, is the mother of one of the characters, Sophia. They were styled as glamorous, and many of the storylines featured them doing really quite incredible things for older women at that time on television. They lead an exciting, affluent life in Miami. They're sexually active, they're going on dates. However, while the situations and the comedy remain really relevant and very fresh, I mean, I watched it with my kids, many of the episodes, and we were laughing. It was still so funny. The comedy hadn't dated at all. When you look at the style of the Golden Girls in terms of clothing, hair, and makeup, I think it looks very dated to our contemporary eye. I don't think their style has aged very well. And this is especially true when you compare it to the contemporary show And Just Like That, which is the spin-off of Sex and the City. You're nodding. So it's being broadcast here in Spain, And Just Like That with Sarah Jessica Parker. Aha, great. Viewed in contrast to that show, and I'm going to show you the contrast, these representations of older women looks really, really old to our contemporary eye. So I want to reflect on this. I want to really think about the way in which the Golden Girls were styled in the show and compare it to the more recent And Just Like That. And I'm interested to raise some questions. So how are older women represented and articulated through dress, body, style in the Golden Girls? What were they doing with their style? How were they being shown? And what differences can we see in And Just Like That with a 30 or so year gap from the Golden Girls to And Just Like That? How have attitudes to fashion and women's aging changed over this time, over this 30 years? Okay, so what's surprising, and I think this is what I experienced, was a complete surprise of, oh my goodness, they are around the same age as the actors in And Just Like That. But their difference in style is quite extreme. And I want to do now, let me see if I can work it out. I'm just going to show you a clip from one of these talk shows, a news show. And the two presenters are reflecting on the style of And Just Like That and the Golden Girls. And it's just after Betty White died, so I think it must be in 2001. She lived to be 99. Betty White was one of the actors in the Golden Girls. So I'm going to, first of all, expand and play. Oh, we have sound. Why is it not playing?
Buzzing about this whole Sex and the City and Just Like That.
Have you been watching?
I haven't.
I'll try and get the volume
I have
up.
not.
Hang on
I watched
a
the first
second.
two.
Yeah.
Where's the volume?
Okay, but these are friends, a group of friends who are in their 50s.
Right.
Okay, and now they're hot on the town, doing their thing.
Yeah, dating.
It's not very loud, is it?
Right.
Well, basically, what we realized is
I
that
don't know
speaking
why
of the incredible Betty White,
I can't make it any louder.
there's such a nostalgia for
Oh,
the
it's a
Golden
real
Girls.
shame.
Yeah.
They're
But
basically
people love.
saying,
And then people have been pointing out this fact.
there's no way I can get the
Miranda and
sound.
Charlotte
I didn't
are
test it. I
approximately
just
the
assumed it would be
same
fine
age
because it's fine on my
as
computer at
the
home.
Golden Girls. Season 1, Rose is 55. Dorothy.
So this is Betty White. She plays Rose, and she had just died. I think that's why they were showing this. But And Just Like That had come out as well the first season.
I'm only 40, but yeah, she's close.
Yeah.
I mean, what?
So here, let's run down the
Yeah,
ages.
it's not
of
going to go
Carrie.
any louder. I find this a lot when I show TV.
54, and Carrie is 55.
Is that so crazy? So now when you think of 54 and
it's not
55,
gonna work.
or
It's
people
fine.
in their 50s, you don't think about the golden
It's not
girls.
essential.
You don't think
It was just a bit of
about
fun.
that, a bunch of, ladies in a
The way
community.
they dress them in the cardigans, I mean, I know I'm wearing a cardigan, but I like to dress like a granny. Granny chic is actually
very cute.
But and I would wear that dress. That looks fab. But it was like they were made them older than they actually were.
I
Okay.
think it's so funny the way that age is perceived now. And I think this often when I think about everything like the TV landscape and I think about the people who anchor all the shows.
Yes.
Great.
I mean,
You
it would
hear
have been
that now. I'll go
unheard
back.
of 25 years ago to say the main anchor at the main anchors at the Today Show would be 50 or older. These are friends, a group of friends who are in their 50s.
Hang on, I'll go back to the start. I'm only going to play a minute.
Right.
Okay, and now they're like, hot on the town, doing their thing.
Yeah, dating, doing all sorts of fun things.
Right.
Well, basically, what we realized is that speaking of the incredible Betty White, there's such a nostalgia for the Golden Girls.
Yeah.
Which people love.
And then people have been pointing out this fact. Carrie, Miranda, and Charlotte are approximately the same age
what?
as the Golden Girls. Season 1, Rose is 55. Dorothy is 53. Blanche,
47?
she's your age. And Sophia is 79.
I'm only 40, but
I'm
yeah,
teasing.
she's close.
Yeah.
I mean, what?
So here, let's run down the ages
Okay,
of
so
Carrie.
here's
and her
Carrie and her pals. Miranda and Charlotte are 54, and Carrie is 55.
Is that so crazy? So now when you think of 54 and 55, or people in their 50s, you don't think about the Golden Girls.
No.
You don't think about that, a bunch of, ladies in a community.
The way they dress them in the cardigans, I mean, I know I'm wearing a cardigan, but I like to dress like a granny. Granny chic is actually...
You're very cute.
But and I would wear that dress. That looks fab. But, it was like they were made them older than they actually were.
I think it's so funny the way that age is perceived now. And I think this often when I think about everything like the TV landscape.
I think we'll leave it there. I'll go back to my presentation. Oh, it's in... Yay, I did it in Spanish. Okay. Okay, I mean, that's what they're expressing, is that kind of surprise. They actually got the ages wrong. I've checked and checked and checked, and they're actually slightly older. The youngest actor was actually 51. That was the woman playing Blanche, Rue McCanahan. And the B. Arthur and Betty White were 63 at the time the show was aired, and Getty, who plays Sophia, who's meant to be 85 in the show, so she was definitely aged, she was 62. So they ranged from early 50s to early 60s. So it's still roughly the same age as the actors in And Just Like That, who were all in their mid to late 50s. So anyway, the shock they experienced was some of the shock I experienced when I was watching the series again and thinking, I'm 56, I'm older than one of the actors in this show. So, and I don't recognize that style as anything that I would wear today, or my friends. So it got me thinking, and it was really rich material to think with. So the Golden Girls was a primetime situation comedy created by, sorry about that, Susan Harris, aired on NBC from 1985 to 1992, spanning 7 seasons. It won all sorts of Oscar awards. It won masses and masses of awards. I don't know if it won an Oscar, but it won a range. It was a really celebrated TV show. It starred an ensemble cast: B. Arthur, who plays Dorothy, Betty White, who plays Rose, Rue McClanahan, it's difficult name to say, who plays Blanche, and Estelle Getty, who plays Sophia, the older lady in the show. And they're depicting the life of these 4 women who share a home in Miami, Florida. These 4 older single women, there are 3 widows, 1 divorcee, are sharing their life together. The owner of the home is Blanche, the woman in yellow, the actor in yellow is Blanche, B. Arthur, the one playing Dorothy at the seated in the front, and Betty, Betty White, who plays Rose, and respond to an ad that Blanche puts in a bulletin board in a shop, and they join her in Blanche's house. And then in the pilot episode, the very first episode, they're joined by Sophia, who is the mother of Dorothy at the bottom, and Sophia joins them when her retirement home burns down. So then the four of them live together. And the show was a significant televisual space through which cultural meanings of aging for women and how women are meant to dress and appear at the time. It really kind of comments on what women would have been wearing and how they would have dressed at the time. Televisual texts give an important role to costume as part of the characterization. And costume carries different meanings to dress. I use this definition in my book. So costume is the clothing of another time or place, or the clothing fit for a performance. Generally, costume is thought to be the clothing people are wearing when they're pretending to be. So costume describes clothing worn in film and television texts where actors pretend to be other people. In terms of screen narrative, costume is worn by actors who bring their own physicality to the role, and it's not just the dress, but their makeup and hair also forms part of the character and supports the overall narrative. Kate Brown, in her excellent book on the Golden Girls, acknowledges the significance of costume for characterization, along with script development, and she notes, quote, Costumes establish each of the women as independent of each other while maintaining visual counterpoints when they are together. The palette is usually very colourful, as you can see here. The sitcom could be said to employ, she says, quote, character archetypes to create a complete ensemble. And that includes, quote, and this is her definition of these characters, the smart but ugly one, which is Dorothy at the bottom, the slut, which is Blanche in yellow, the ditzy blonde, Rose, and the old world grandmother, respectively. And she talks about those archetypes in her book. She gives a chapter to each of the characters as an archetype. But she does explore the ways in which these characters go beyond the archetypes to make a complexity. She says there's a kind of complexity to their characters as well that provides a, quote, powerful statement about women's shifting identities in the late 20th century. In their landmark edited collection on costume in film, Gaines and Herzog focus on the ways that realist texts construct woman through many different aspects, noting the physical construction of costume that brings into play the physicality of the actor's body, which is also shaped by diet and exercise. The interplay between costume and the actor's body can be analysed through the operations of the costume designer or wardrobe department. Fortunately, for the purposes of me doing this research, there are interviews with the series costume designer Judy Evans. There's a kind of archive that I was sent from the editor of the book. He'd gathered a lot of material. And there are some interviews with Judy Evans, the costume designer, and she's very clear about how she works with the actors' bodies when designing for their characters. So I drew on some of these papers. In interviews Evans gave to newspapers at the time the show was broadcast, she explains how she designs with the actor's physical body and the kind of character combined, evidencing Gaines and Herzog's argument. Thus, she describes how each character must be dressed according to the concerns of the actors, quote, their weight swings and figure faults, end quote. And she describes how she designs with these constraints in mind. So the actors have their own anxieties about their body that she has to build into her design for them. Sometimes she's designing, and sometimes she's just going and buying clothes off the peg from department stores. It wasn't all designed. I think only B. Arthur was designed because she's so tall. She describes how she has to design everything for her, and she uses the actor's height as one of the kind of constraints. She wants to keep her character soft, and she doesn't want a mannish look. So she's always trying to work with the actor's height to kind of create a softer look for the character Dorothy. To accomplish this, she uses soft materials. She describes using linen and washing the linen to soften it, and silk. For Rue McClanachlin, who plays Blanche, the so-called sexy one, she uses other fabrics. She says, quote, I use light and flighty fabric that moves a lot, that's sensuous, precisely because these qualities bring, quote, a sexy quality, which is clearly apparent and needed in the characterization of Blanche, who's flirtatious and very vain in the show. For Betty White, who plays the ditzy character Rose, Evans notes the actor's body is, quote, more rounded bust, waist and hips. And she also describes her in other interviews as buxom. And she has to really work with that because Rose is meant to be quite demure and very traditional. I'll talk a little bit about the problem of that, her body, but she's designing and giving Rose a certain kind of waist and sort of kind of disguising her buxomness, but giving her a waist, making her wear these sort of shirted dresses, waisted dresses. All the characters wear bright colours. There's a palette that she uses, although she does talk about the producers wanting her to make Sophia more like an Italian grandmother, because she's from Italy, and make her wear dark clothes, and she worries about the way that will change the mise-en-scène of the kind of palette of colours. As a sociologist, I'm interested to explore the ways in which these on-screen constructions of older women might shed light upon wider attitudes to female age and ageing. We can talk about this in terms of verisimilitude. This is a realist text, so these are meant to be clothes that women would have worn at the time. As a realist text, it's meant to resemble the world beyond the text. As Harwood and Howard note, TV is not just a visual medium through which we obtain relaxation, but it also provides us with texts through which we construct realities surrounding us. Similarly, Brown argues that television conveys messages about identity and representation through costume, staging, and so on. Bearing this point in mind, then how can we approach the Golden Girls as saying something about older women's bodily appearance at this time? And this is what I want to examine and want to think about in relation to biological and cultural aging. And through some kind of personal reflection as well, what the styling of the Golden Girls might reveal about attitudes to older women's bodies as it depicted through style, and how this has changed. So, as argued by sociologists of aging and the body, Mike Featherstone and Mike Hepworth, and this is an old essay, but it's written at the time, it's contemporary to the Golden Girls, and they were describing retirement imagery in retirement magazines. And things they're describing happening in these images were very similar to what we're seeing in the Golden Girls at the same time, so that's why their essay is quite useful. So they start by talking about age as not simply a biological feature of the body, but an aspect of identity imbued with meanings, historically and culturally located. So aging is as much about culture as it is about cellular processes. Aging is more than an indisputable biological fact, because what counts as old across society and across history has changed. Featherstone and Hepworth argue that consumer-driven take on aging is the one we're familiar with, and that emerges from around the 1960s through the idea of positive aging. They note two developments that prompted this approach. First, gerontology reconceptualized aging to denote bodily changes that did not necessarily lead to disease and impairment. One could age without those problems, without those physical problems. The science of gerontology parallels the increase in longevity facilitated by better diet and lifestyle and healthcare over the 20th century. Second, positive aging involves the emergence of, quote, new norms of age-related behavior and associated rites of passage out of the more traditional and arguably static concept of an amorphous and undifferentiated old age. So we see new norms emerging in this period, new ideas reshaping our understandings of aging, illness, the idea of aging as just being about illness and decline. There was, they argue, a cross-fertilization between images, these ideas from gerontology and images of aging within popular culture and consumer culture more broadly. And so these ideas were really taking a hold from the 1960s onwards. So the Golden Girls really sits within this period of history. It's the context within which these women are being dressed and styled. And we're seeing a reconceptualizing of aging through this positive aging discourse in around the mid to late 20th century. However, as I'll go on to argue, these understandings of age, what was seen as fresh and new about the Golden Girls in the 1980s and early 90s, has really changed again, because our ideas of aging have continued to change, and anti-aging discourses have emerged in the 21st century. So I'll reflect a little bit on that at the end. It makes the Golden Girls look less radical, I will argue. So the body sits at the center of these discourses around age and aging. With all stages of women's lives, the bodily appearance is often the focus of the life course. And aging especially is a focus for women more than men. It's a thing that's considered and more visible for women than men. So there are biological processes that are kind of natural, but they are malleable. They're subject to intervention that are cultural. Aging has always been demarcated, according to Twigg, this excellent book on fashion and aging, the only book I know of fashion and aging, from 2013, so it's over 10 years old now. But in this book, she looks at how dress is age-ordered, with stages of the life course marked by dress, baptism, clothing, wedding dresses, Holy Communion, and so on. There's strong moral undertone to many of the styles of dress through the life course. Widows used to show respect by wearing black for a year, in Victorian times anyway, for a year. Respectable women, even today, aren't meant to show too much flesh in public. So there's lots of moral discourses about the body that are especially gendered. So as aging happens, a symbolic moment of aging occurs. This is in Twigg's book as well, from around age 50, coinciding with the menopause as a biological marker, an event, if we can call it an event, that our culture tends to view negatively. One major gender difference is the emphasis placed on women's bodies regarding the bodily signs of aging. And Twigg notes, quote, women's lives at all stages are more closely policed with regard to appearance so that men can age gracefully, but women, by contrast, are subject to judgments that require them to meet the youthful ideal. Normative femininity, she argues, is formed around the image of youthfulness. And this loss of youthfulness, Brown also discusses. She says that aging represents not only a loss of vitality, but a loss of beauty and desirability. And she goes on to note moral judgments on dress are linked to age. Prohibitions on dress for older women relate to the body and its exposure. And what can you expose? How much skin can you expose of the body as you are an older woman? And I think those observations, those scholarly observations and arguments can be evidenced in the way the four characters in the Golden Girls are dressed. They never expose too much flesh. They're always dressed very well covered, cleavage, legs, even tops of arms and shoulders aren't really shown very much. And indeed, Evans, the costume designer, refers in interviews to this need to kind of be appropriate, dress the actors appropriately. She's very mindful of the actors' aging bodies. So there's a clear age concern with the way in which she thinks about Betty, the buxom one, the one that's kind of quite ditzy and traditional. So for her, when she talks about her in interviews, she calls her body buxom. She's trying to manage that and make her body more demure. This dress is a kind of example of that. Whereas, in fact, we know that buxom is a characteristic that's accentuated and exaggerated in younger women, from Jane Russell, Marilyn Monroe, to today. So there's a kind of obvious sense of aging, that the aging, curvy body has to be kind of dressed appropriately. So in other words, we could say then, or I'm arguing, that the Golden Girls really does exemplify a particular moment of our understandings of old age. Featherstone and Hepworth note how, from the 1960s onwards, old age becomes commodified, and there are lots and lots of commodities sold to older people. They're looking at retirement imagery, so they're looking at holidays for retired people, and hobbies like golf for retired people, and goods and services. So there's a commodification taking place, and there is a style of old age that I think the Golden Girls really exemplifies at that moment in history. It exemplifies a kind of positive aging in the mid to late 20th century. So what's happened today? And I want to try and move on fairly quickly and try and wrap up within the hour, if possible. So, yes, the questions then we might ask. I want to offer you some personal reflections, actually, before asking some questions. I want to really reflect back on when I first watched The Golden Girls, as opposed to when I was watching it for this research. So back in 1985, when I watched the show as a teenager, with my grandmother, Dorothy, Blanche, Rose, and Sophia, all resembled women that I knew in their 50s and 60s. So the Golden Girls were really dressed in ways I recognised from my grandmothers and my aunts, my great aunts, who were a similar age to the actors in their 50s and 60s. My paternal grandmother, Pearl, loved to dress up, owned many outfits similar to the ones shown in this screen. She had various fur stoles. In episode 1 of the first season, Blanche, she's not got blonde hair, but she's in the pink trouser suit. But in that episode, she's very vain and she goes out wearing a fur stole. My nan had loads of these fur stoles, fox heads and feet. And she's wearing this stole, and the comedy is, of course, they're in Miami and it's like 80 Fahrenheit, whatever, 35 centigrade, but she's wearing a fur stole. But the style of their clothing, this formal day wear, like wearing matched outfits, formal, matching trouser suits, dresses with pantyhose, or what Americans call pantyhose, we call tights. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, loved clothes, was very vain, and she dressed very much like the Golden Girls at the time. She didn't own a pair of jeans or some baggy sweatshirt pants or anything like that. And there was a clear policy in the wardrobe department to avoid fashion. My nan and my aunts didn't wear fashion. They wore a certain style of dress that they got from certain shops that was not the dress that I would have worn. So there was a policy of buying from those sorts of retailers for the wardrobe department, for the Golden Girls, and to steer clear of anything that was too fashionable, or, quote, too trendy, Evans calls it. She's quoted as saying as well, I didn't want them looking old. We hope there's a freshness to dressing. She doesn't want them to look old, she wants them to look fresh, but she doesn't want them to be trendy. So there's a sense of appropriate. What is appropriate dress for an older woman? And fashion isn't really very appropriate at this moment in time. And indeed, Twigg, writing in 2013 in her book that I had just up on the screen, she's arguing 2013, 10 years ago, fashion and age sit uncomfortably together, while, quote, greyness is marked by retirement from display and engagement with the erotic and the style conscious, end quote. And I'm thinking 10 years on, I wouldn't think that's true today. There's actually a huge number of influencers I follow that are all doing grey hair at the moment and really celebrating it and being very stylish with it. So I think that even in the 10 years since her book was published and now, there's been a lot of changes. And what I would say is that women today, women of my age today, do engage with fashion in a way that, and just like that, engages with fashion. So compared to the Golden Girls and Just Like That is a very radical departure. It's a stark contrast to the notions of age-appropriate outfits you saw in the Golden Girls. And almost anything goes in And Just Like That. And Sex and the City, obviously the earlier show. The 3 characters in the current season, the current series And Just Like That, the clothing is again character-led. Carrie's character is particularly fashion-forward, as it was in Sex and the City, and her outfits frequently make it into fashion magazines. So magazines from Vogue to Grazia are always from Sex and the City, from the early days of Sex and the City to the day, and Just Like That show, always commenting on the outfits in the show, and they make it into fashion, and they spark trends. So I think that's still happening, even though these actors now are much older. And one of the most notable signs I see in my own personal life is all the women I know of my age and around their 50s and early 60s, they're all wearing fashionable clothes and they're shopping in shops similar to their daughters. And in fact, thinking about the clothes that we have in my house, my daughters borrow most of my clothes, although I don't borrow theirs, I have to say. They wear very baggy sweatshirt pants or very, very short, skimpy dresses. And I don't do either of those. But they do borrow my clothes a lot. There seems to be fashion and trend seem to blur in the age generations in a way that never happened in my youth when I was watching the show in the 1980s with my grandmother, where I was not going to wear their clothes. My daughters are teenagers, they're 20 and 15, and they do wear my clothes. So there's a lot that has changed today that I think we can see in this slide, hopefully highlights. Perhaps more striking even than the clothes is the hair and makeup of the Golden Girls. All the characters have short, grey, white, blonde hair in a tight perm that's stiffly blow-dried. It doesn't move. I mean, it's the hair that just does not move, right? A close-up. I've got the best close-up I could see was, again, of Rose. I couldn't find many headshots. But this is typical of 1980s makeup as well. High coverage foundation, highly rouged cheeks, highly bright lipstick, powdered face, a very dry, crepey face. And I had a favorite great aunt called Julia, and she looked just like Betty White here, only she had jet black hair. She dyed it jet black. But actually, in face terms, very similar. And my Aunt Julia was always immaculately dressed in smart dresses or smart matching knitwear, shoes and handbag matching. Just like Rose, she favored bright citrus colors, waisted dresses, always knee length, never shorter, always with tights or pantyhose, always with high heels. Like the characters in The Golden Girls, my Aunt Julia wore very heavy makeup, lots of foundation, lots of rouge, lots of bright blusher, lipstick, lots of powder, and a very stiff perm. It was always black, jet black. And it was styled in a big bouffant, and it didn't move. It was stiff. And when I loved her, but when I hugged her, she smelt of hairspray and makeup, very, very strongly perfumed makeup. Very like the Golden Girls at the same time. And then just like that, we see hair and makeup that's significantly different. We see the three main characters, two of whom have their hair long and soft, not lacquered. Makeup is very light, quote-unquote natural. They're obviously wearing a lot of makeup, but it's natural. In the parlance of today's Instagrammers and makeup on TikTok, we might even say it's, quote, dewy, about fresh skin, not powdered and dry skin. And these features of hair and makeup, I think, serve to make the women more youthful to our contemporary eye compared to the Golden Girls. And in fact, there's a weird reversal. If you look on TikTok and Instagram, young women now wear lots of thick makeup. My daughters don't, fortunately. But a lot of the makeup now, young women are piling on foundation and contouring, and it takes like 3 hours to produce the face. And it's older women that wear less makeup. So there's been a kind of switch round. Yeah, like contouring phenomenon that the girl... My daughter can do it when she's going out and she has like 3 inches of makeup. She looks amazing, but, it's all makeup and amazing, but it takes 3 hours to do. So there's a reversal going on there as well in the generations. Youth is a subject that's actually discussed in both shows, and I thought there was a nice contrast. In the first episode of season 1, Dorothy... the tall old daughter of Sophia, she goes home and she recalls a conversation she had in the staff common room. She is a teacher. And she says, I was laughing and joking with my younger colleagues, having a really good time, and then went to the bathroom and got a shock when she saw her face in the mirror. She just felt she was young again, and then it was only seeing her face in the mirror that she remembered that she isn't the same age as her contemporaries. It was a kind of slightly melancholic moment at the beginning of the season. And Sarah Jessica Parker, in season 1, episode 6 of And Just Like That, publicly, sorry, that's a different point. In the episode, she's taken around skincare clinics to discuss Botox and filler. And she's with a friend, and she's going around, and she declines to do anything in the end. And in fact, the actor, Sarah Jessica Parker, has also publicly said she doesn't do filler or Botox, and her face does appear to be fairly mobile. She just thinks, I'm an actor, I need to be able to use my face. So it was quite interesting. There was actually a commentary on anti-aging treatment in the series with her declining to do anything to her face in terms of these treatments. So what's happened? Why is this big change? I really see a big change. I hope you see a big change between these two TV shows. So what's produced this radical shift in representation of older women, and how are older women represented in the contemporary media vis-a-vis fashion and style? And I think a couple of things have happened. I think the discourse on anti-aging has presented more options for women to intervene in and act on their body, their aging body, and stop the clock in various ways, or provide them with alternatives to aging. And we can see a range of people in the media doing different things with this, from Madonna, who is extensively remodeled herself with treatments. This is Madonna in 2023, she's 65. And she's shamelessly using many of these anti-aging procedures, and along with people like J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, she wears the clothes that she wore when she was first famous in her 20s and 30s. There's no concession made to growing old. She doesn't want to grow old gracefully or be age appropriate. She's wearing corsets and garters and all kinds of things that she wore when she was a young woman. And there's a range of options available in the public eye different notions of age appropriate. We can see here there's this is Brooke Shields. I've got her age, she's 57, similar to Robin Wright Penn. They're often the media focus, the focus of media discussions about being glamorous and sexy, choosing to kind of be glamorous and sexy and wear fashionable clothes. Some of these actors and actresses, I mean, Christy Turlington, I don't think does treatments as such, but has promoted anti-aging skincare and potions and lotions. Cindy Crawford has been vocal about using Botox and filler. So there's a whole range of options available for these women in the public eye. Older actors like Helen Mirren, she's 78, appear to embrace their older face and are not appearing to use anti-aging products, maybe beyond a bit of moisturizer. So there's a whole range of options available. I've mentioned Sarah Jessica Parker talking publicly about not using tweakments on her own face, not using filler. Besides the mainstream media, we can see diversity on social media like Instagram. We've got many options available. If you search under hashtags, you'll find all kinds of different styles happening. People are uploading their content, older women now, doing fashion, doing style, and uploading content to platforms like Instagram. And more brands, if you look on Instagram, are willing to work with older models. This woman I follow here, Pia, she is like a muse for some designer labels in London, one called Wise, Me and M. She's always featuring style, and she's in her early to mid-60s. And these are kind of influencers now on the platform working with brands and retailers. However, we need future research. To what extent are older women's everyday dress practices engaging with this? What's the range amongst everyday women, non-celebrity women? This is what I normally do as a sociologist. I normally talk to people. So there's new research needed to see what women are doing during the life course, the older post-menopause life course. What are they doing? What's their engagement with dress? Different communities of style on Instagram and TikTok, we can look at them, and we need to do more research on those communities. And also, I would mind going back to my model agencies and seeing, I know that there are more older models now on represented by model agencies because brands are willing to work with them. So there's a range of research that we need to explore. And I think I'm just going to really wrap up here by saying, I hope I've given you some thoughts on reflections on ideas about aging, cultural variations between the 1980s and the 21st century. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there is no prejudice to older women, that there's no ageism or misogyny. There is still discrimination for older women in many workplaces. And I certainly don't want to fall into the trap of claiming that there's a neoliberal freedom, that we can do whatever we like. There are, of course, many obstacles, many social inequalities, so that women, we don't all have access to fashion, style, makeup, tweakments. So there's lots of social inequality that we need to be thoughtful about if we're doing further research on women and aging. Clearly, celebrities have access to things that many ordinary women simply don't have access. So we need a properly intersectional analysis of aging, women, fashion, and design, styling. Yeah, and I'm going to finish there. I've already talked for an hour. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it 50 minutes. I'm so sorry. But
Joanne, thank you so much for your very, very accurate lecture, and for the joy and also a little bit of espoir for people who we are aging. When I was young, I used to see Northern Europe women, how they were dressed in cardigan, jeans, sneakers. It was completely different of my mother and my grandmother, and I thought that they were so naturally dressed, which is, of course, also artificial. But there were plenty of colors. Danish woman, plenty. We had only here in Spain 3 colors, like black and brown and blue. Navy blue, and when I went there was plenty of lilac, orange and red. It was wonderful. And when I see your images, we recover also the joy of colors.
Okay.
And thank you also for updating the world of fashion studies and sociology, which is so necessary, because the world is changing, we are changing, and we have to really have a new point of view of what is happening, and not only studying fashion and dress history as always it has been done. Also, the new study of the Golden Girls make us think how old people have changed so much in the last 30 years. Their image has changed so much. They looked like our grandmothers, and now, well, the new ones here, they don't look so much as we do, because they are also very artificial, very cultivated in a sense. They are not as they are normally, or the people you meet normally in the street.
It's aspirational dressing, Sex in the City.
And they are also like a model, no, or a trend that is very. Also, you have these hairdressers that very artificial and not so common, but it's very interesting. So I will invite you. Os invito a hacerle preguntas a Joanne, ya que la tenemos aquí, que es un lujo y un placer. Ahora. El micrófono, no sé. Pero, si podéis en inglés mejor, porque ella os entenderá.
I don't know, it works.
Y si no, podéis hablar de viva voz, porque yo creo que si habláis fuertes os entenderemos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanne, for your talk. I have two questions. Well, I have many questions, but two specifically. The first one is between the two options, the Golden Girls and Just Like That. Which option you think is more gerontophobic?
More.
I don't know how to say this.
Gerontophobic?
More
against against aged people. Aging.
Against, I don't know exactly the word.
Gerontology.
I was looking for the word, but there's no.
I don't know what the translation would be.
Gerontophobic.
Yeah, gerontophobic. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is that, well, nowadays we can see older models on fashion shows, but usually I think we are constructing an ideal old model. No? I think we are not being more open with the concept of beauty. We are just creating another stereotype, and we just accept this small stereotype for old person, old model, old beauty. And moreover, some fashion marks are including famous people as model. No? Now I think the grandma of I can remember that. Famous people, rich people, famous people, and I don't know if we are walking forward, accepting a more open concept of beauty, or otherwise we are not doing anything about this.
Yeah.
So I would like to know your opinion about this. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand the first question. Are you saying which is anti-aging of the two?
Yeah, because I'm not sure which one is worse. Because the first one, you are accepting that old people are like this, are apart from society, apart from fashion, apart from everything. They are living together. Yeah. They are having so fun, but you are creating an idea of old people that it's not, well, I can explain myself better. Yeah. But the second one is like denying the pass of time. So I don't know which option is worse.
I just think they're different. I'm not sure I could rank them in terms of worse. I suppose if you said, where would I want to be? Would I want to be in Miami, Florida with the Golden Girls, or living in a very nice luxury loft apartment in New York, hanging out with Carrie? I'd probably choose the New York option and have glamorous clothes. But I mean, I think that obviously what I've looked at are representations, right? And this is what I don't normally do. I never normally just speak to representations. I usually like my data to come from practices in the real world. So we know that these are representations. It's not real life. So that's a given, really. If you're doing a textual analysis, you're looking at the constructions within the text and you can compare. How they translate in reality would need further research, which is what I mentioned at the end, really. What I think maybe I'm going to do now is to take some of the ideas I've worked through in the representational world and see what people are doing and how ordinary people, you and I, non-celebrity people, understand aging. I think the difference, I would say today, is there are definitely more options and ways to age. I think the Golden Girls, in its day, the Golden Girls was Sex and the City, right? What they were doing was lead this incredibly exciting, affluent life. They were wearing clothes that my nan really loved to watch because they looked beautiful to that day. So they were the equivalent of Sex and the City. But it was aspirational. Nobody lived like that. My nan lived in Liverpool in a little council flat, and she's looking at this amazingly glamorous life. So like when we watch Sex and the City, it's the same thing. It's a glamorous, aspirational life. And it's playful and it's exaggerated. They're more glamorous than you and I. So I think we are within the realm of representation. And to what extent are they better or worse? You could say, well, it depends on the viewer. You could have been watching the Golden Girls in the 80s and felt depressed because you weren't living in Miami with beautiful clothes and going on cruises. Just like you could be depressed sitting in a council house today in Liverpool and be watching Sex and the City and just like that and feel, oh, my life doesn't compare. But I don't know whether people do that kind of comparison. I think maybe we watch shows like this for escapism, relaxation. We don't necessarily treat it as real. We know that it's a kind of aspirational, fantasy, glamorous life. So I was just interested in the ways the representations are very radically different of what it means to look to be in your 50s or 60s. And there is, I think, a difference there. But I think the question about what people do and how do we feel we're aging as ordinary people, I think that requires a lot of further research. And there isn't much research on older people and fashion and dress, men and women. There's just not very much literature. So I guess that's why I want to do further work where I'm not looking at the representations, but I want to look at people's practices. If you look online, I follow and now increasingly following older style influencers. So I've found lots of people who, through hashtags, I've found 60s style, 50s style, 70s and 80s style. And I think, again, it's aspirational because people put up their best outfits. They're not showing you what they wear when they get up in the morning to go around to the shop to buy some bread. They're showing you an outfit for an occasion. But what's fascinating about social media is, again, you see a range of different ways of aging. Women embracing lots and lots of platforms where going grey is the feature of the platform. That person's handle, their moniker, is about going grey. And it's exploring what it means to not dye your hair and all the differences that might mean for your clothing. And you could say that's more real. I mean, it's women talking about that, or hair loss. So there's lots of other spaces where we can see a more everyday practice around aging. We can observe differences amongst people. Obviously, if they're posting online, it's an edited version of their life, just like the Golden Girls is an edit as well. But I think there's a lot of, I think there's probably more variation in how you want to age today than it would have been in my nan's day. I think when you were 50-something, 60-something in 1980, you just went to Marks and Spencer's and you wore a very certain uniform, a limited range of clothes, and you didn't do fashion. And I think today we have maybe more options, obviously depending on our resources, but we have more ways to age. Is it better or worse? Again, it depends. You might feel oppressed by it. You might think, oh, I'm never going to look that good. But you can always find someone on Instagram who isn't doing it that way. You can always find someone whose style is close to your own, and you can follow them. I don't know if it answers your question.
And about the second question, about the models?
The second question, yeah, I mean, obviously when brands are using older people, they're using older, beautiful people. They, you know, they may have been former models, and they've aged. I mean, Christy Turlington, Linda Evangelista, they've all come back now. So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily that we've now got there's no standard of beauty. I think there are still standards of beauty. However, you could say that I do follow retailers who don't have young models in there. They do live stream. A lot of retailers now do live stream, so you can watch the collection and they'll have real customers. So they're not really using models anymore. I mean, they still have a catalogue and they still have a website where you can see the clothes, but a lot of their engagement is with the women sales staff, and they'll be size 16 or size 18. They'll be short, tall, much older than a fashion model, and they're modeling the clothes to the consumer via the Instagram platform. So I think it's not that everywhere we look now, there's no idea of beauty. Of course, there are still notions of beauty. We're never going to not have that. But I think there is a slightly wider range, and I think the way in which some retailers retail to older women, not using young women's bodies, I think that's a preference. I don't want to see what the clothes looks like on a 6-foot skinny model. I want to see what they're going to look like on a 5'5" woman of around a size 8 to 10. I need to see something that looks a bit like the way I look, and then I get more of an idea of whether or not I should order that garment. Because if it's on a 6-foot model, it's not going to look good on me. And I do think it's a little bit better today, perhaps.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tenemos para una o dos intervenciones. ¿Sí?
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for your interesting presentation. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. First of all, congratulations for your presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask you that you are about the identification with brands, with the styles, and with specific sceneries for these old women, and it's very interesting. And I want to ask questions. The first one is focused on, in the case of Latin America, not many people have this identification with European style, and the debates of decolonizing include India school, like Chakravanti, Ranjit Guha, Appadurai, is different than the decolonizing school from Latin America, because the relationship with India, UK, and Mexico, in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, those kind of countries, understand the decolonizing in different visions. So I want to ask you if you, because I already read your book, and I want to ask you if you consider a specific school to understand decolonizing, as Benedict Anderson said. Benedict Anderson said that there's an imaginary community that it's including, for example, in the case of United States, that you can live there and you can have those experiences with Mexican boundaries, but you observe the culture from the United States, but at the same time you have the culture from Mexico in these kind of boundaries. So my question is focused on that. If you understand a specific school, in the case of Latin America, to understand fashion in this decolonizing, I think it's quite confused. But if you, yes, because I think nowadays we have a nationalism more strong than other, in different, in comparison with other years. Nationalism try to strong the identity of the country. So if you, in that case, you notice a specific element in the decolonizing connection with UK, Latin America, I think that's the first one. And the second one, that is focused on the representation and construction. Did you identify a group of fashion brands for adults? So if you recognize in your research a specific brand or group of brands who develop textiles, color palettes, and designs for this group of old people, well, adult group that have a more economic solvents to buy something. Because something that I start to think in your presentation is that adults are already more, they have more money. In comparison with youngest people, because they already work around the years. So if you identify a specific brand to this kind of textiles or brand, that's
okay.
all. Thank you so much.
I'll just answer that one very quickly because I think I can. I mean, yes, as an older woman, I have brands I know that cater for my body, my style. More expensive, for sure. So yeah, I could. So I would say that in the UK, because I can't talk generally, and I don't know how wide the brands are, but there are a number of brands that I would say cater for older women. There's a brand, I think it's very London-based, called Wise, W-Y-S-E. It's actually the name. It's not Wise as in wise women. It's the name of the designer, the lead designer. And I can't remember my first name, but anyway, and that I would say is a brand that really does know its target audience, which is women in their sort of late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s onwards. And all the women, the staff wear the clothes are of that generation, and it is an expensive brand. I generally buy it in the sale because it is really quite expensive, but the sale can be half price. So yeah, I would say there's a bunch of brands occupying that space. The one you might know of is Me and M. Which is a brand that I think does retail to kind of women that could be younger, but I think it's a style of dressing that appeals to older women and is expensive again because there is a thing called the grey pound, right? These are, this is a big market now for brands to attract women, older women, because they've got the money to spend on good quality clothing. Also, I'm trying to avoid fast fashion at the moment, so I generally buy a few things from good brands, then go to Henny's and all the shops I used to shop in when I was young. I don't go there anymore because I just don't want to buy that kind of clothing. I want to buy something that's quality. So it is more money, you're right. So I think that's fairly, I'd say from the UK perspective, I can't talk about Spain, but I would say there are brands in that space. Your first question, I'm not entirely sure I know exactly what you mean, but if I'm writing my assessment, my summary is written from the point of view of a European woman and a scholar in this field dealing with these questions of decolonization and how we need to address a very narrow perspective that has been dominated fashion studies. Yes, if you go to Latin America, you will have a very different sense of what decolonizing means there than if you go to India. I haven't spent a lot of time in Latin America, but I have been to India. Even if you go to Australia, as soon as you flip from the West, you see the world and you see everything is a completely different way. So yes, decolonizing means something very different in Latin American countries than it would do in India, because the history of colonization is different. The interactions and relations between those places and the kind of colonial powers is very, very different. So by virtue of the colonizing process being very, very different where you look in the world, the decolonizing perspective is going to also be very different. Where your reference points are, where the power battles are, it's all going to be different. The book isn't a book about that. I mean, it will be fascinating to write that book, actually, that actually explores what decolonizing really means from different places. But I am limited in my own subjectivity from my own expertise in terms of I am looking at these questions as a white woman, a white scholar in Europe who's participated in a certain scholarship that now needs to be decolonized. But I hope that answers your question in the sense that, yes, I do think it looks different when you move outside the West, definitely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks.
Gracias. Yo creo que es el momento de hacer la pausa. Thank you so much, Joanne. Joanne está con nosotros aún el resto del día, podéis hablar con ella, estará encantada. Y vamos a comer para estar aquí puntuales a las 3. Gracias.